During my childhood, every year my family would follow a tradition where we'd head up to northern Michigan for a weekend in October. My Uncle Jim used to own a 4-acre property there. The house on the property had plenty of room for everyone, with 5 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms. 2 of the rooms were designated for my cousins and my siblings, with my brother and sister sharing one room, and my 4 cousins in another. The other rooms were for our parents. Uncle Jim was a big hunter and fisherman. He would go on camping trips for hunting all around the country. My dad had joined him a few times, even though he was an animal lover and wouldn't hurt a fly. Part of the land my uncle owned included a large chunk of forest. He had marked several trees with red paint to mark the property line, and beyond that was just county-owned forest. The nearest house was probably miles away. One day during lunch, my brother Adam, my cousins Jake and Joe, and I came up with the idea of camping in the woods that night, while our dads were talking about hunting. They were all for it since they had been drinking, so they were in a good mood, and more likely to say yes. Our moms, however, weren't too thrilled about the idea but didn't outright say no. So, my dad and Uncle Jim agreed to take the 4 of us into the woods with a tent. My girl cousins and sister were not part of the plan. This was just for us boys. We set off into the woods, and when Joey, the youngest of us, started complaining that it was too far, the dads just laughed it off. That's how they were when they were together, especially when they had been drinking. They loved to tease us. At the time, I was the oldest, around 13. Adam and Jake were around 10, and Joe was about 9. We ventured beyond the property line, to a small clearing in the woods covered in soft green moss that my uncle referred to as deer beds. He said it was a great place for camping and that he'd used it before. Our dads, half drunk, gave us a quick lesson on how to set up the tent. They made us help so it wasn't all on them. The tent was big enough for 4 kids, and once it was set up, we put our sleeping bags inside. We set everything up during the day because it was a lot easier than trying to do it at night. Afterward, we went back to the house and played games outside until dinner. At dinner, our moms once again voiced their concerns about us being too young to be out in the woods alone. Our dads reassured them that we'd be fine, and I remember my dad joking that they'd be close enough to hear our screams if anything went wrong. Later, as it got dark, our dads took us back to the woods to the tent. We had flashlights and extra blankets since it was cold. I even brought a deck of Uno cards for us to play. Once we were all settled into the tent, my dad and Uncle Jim headed back to the house. That's when we were truly alone in the woods. It was darker than I expected, and we weren't as close to the house as we thought. We couldn't even see any light from it. We started playing Uno, and after a while, we heard a scream in the distance. It sounded like a woman's scream. Everyone went silent and exchanged nervous glances. I remembered hearing that a fox's scream could sound like a woman's, so I told the group, hoping it would calm them down. It seemed to work, and we kept playing. I even won every round, but then the scream came again, this time much louder and closer. It sounded much more human this time. We all froze, and Joe looked like he was about to cry. I told everyone to turn off their flashlights, and we crawled into our sleeping bags, sitting in complete darkness. None of us had the courage to run back to the house, fearing that whatever was out there might chase us. It felt safer inside the tent, even if it was just made of cloth. So, we waited in silence, whispering to each other, wondering if it could still be a fox. I honestly didn't know what it was, but I hoped it wasn't anything to worry about. We were all on edge when we suddenly heard rapid footsteps crunching leaves, coming closer to the tent. They stopped right outside, and then there was a terrifying, gut-wrenching scream, just like the one we had heard earlier. This time, it was right outside the tent, and the tent itself started shaking violently. We all screamed in terror. Jake and Jim were screaming in fear, while my brother and I were shouting things like, "Get out of the tent!" I quickly unzipped the door, and one by one, we ran into the woods, flashlights on. The run back to the house was one of the scariest experiences of my life, like a life or death moment. We screamed the whole way back, and by the time we reached the property, our entire family was already outside, worried and looking for us. We explained what had happened, the screams, the tent shaking, and everyone was shocked and horrified. But then I realized our cousins, Jamie and Christina, and my sister, weren't outside. I called out for my dad and Uncle Jim, accusing them of sending one of the girls to scare us, but they showed us that the girls were already in bed. That's when we realized that someone we didn't know was out there in the woods. My dad and Uncle Jim grabbed some rifles and went back out to search the woods. They returned after a while, saying they hadn't found anyone. The next day, we all helped bring the tent and other stuff back to the house. Needless to say, that was the last time any of us camped out in those woods. In fact, we didn't even play outside after dark anymore. What kid would after such an experience? To this day, I can't say for sure who or what was out there or why they did what they did, but I've never forgotten the terror we felt that night. This experience happened to me in 2020, during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. The world was shutting down and everyone was stuck indoors. Being an avid backpacker and camper, I saw the lockdown as an opportunity to travel to different national parks and camp out in solitude. One of the places I chose was a creek in Rocky Mountain National Park, Colorado. Without revealing too much about myself, I'll just say that something happened with my job back in 2019 that damaged my reputation significantly. A mistake I made cost several people a lot of money, and as expected, it didn't sit well with them. A good number of people despised me for it. As a result, I had to change apartments, get a new phone number, and eventually quit my job. For a while, I was relentlessly harassed. Random numbers would text me, sometimes with threatening messages. I wasn't sure if it was the same person using multiple numbers or different people altogether, but the harassment went on for some time. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I was relieved, assuming they'd lost interest or moved on. At this point, I wasn't working. I was taking time for myself, which is why I decided to travel and camp at different national parks. It was a chance to escape, to breathe. I drove 3 hours to Rocky Mountain National Park, parked my truck, and started hiking up the trail toward the creek. The path was empty, which wasn't surprising. This was early in the lockdown when people were still taking it seriously and staying indoors. Plus, it was still winter. The ground was covered in a thin layer of snow, hard enough to make that distinct crunching sound with every step I took. After a while, I reached the creek. It wasn't frozen, but still flowing, and the peacefulness of the place was exactly what I needed. I found a spot off the trail to set up camp, pitched my tent, chopped some wood, and got a fire going. I cooked some sausages on my little camping stove and then settled by the fire with a book. As darkness fell, I switched on my headlamp and decided to roll a joint. After taking a few hits, I felt my phone vibrate. It was strange because apart from my family, I rarely got texts. When I pulled out my phone, I saw multiple messages from an unknown number. My heart skipped a beat when I read them. The first text said, "How's your camping going, buddy?" The second one followed, "It's beautiful out here." And then the third, "I see why you came up here." I froze. These weren't generic messages. They were written as if someone was there with me. I replied, "Who is this?" If it had been just the first message, I might have thought it was a family member checking in, but these texts made it clear that whoever it was could see me. I started looking around, scanning the dark woods with my headlamp, feeling more paranoid with each passing second. The weed in my system only heightened my anxiety. I stood up, doing a full 360, looking in every direction. Then, I grabbed my P365 handgun from my bag for some semblance of safety. Normally, I'd put the fire out before calling it a night, but the thought of total darkness terrified me. Instead, I crawled into my tent, clutching my phone and staring at the texts, waiting for a response. None came. Minutes dragged on, and I just wanted the high to wear off. I tried to distract myself by reading, but my mind was stuck on those texts. Eventually, I gave up and decided to watch YouTube videos on my phone. I chose a murder documentary, a strange choice considering the circumstances, but it helped pass the time. Then, another text came in. "Doesn't matter anymore." My heart started pounding all over again. I replied, "How did you know I'm camping?" But once again, there was no response. The anxiety was becoming unbearable. Was this a prank? Was it someone from my past, still holding a grudge? The real question was, how did they know I was here? An hour passed, and the fire outside began to die down. The woods were completely silent. No bugs, just the faint sound of wind. The second my video ended, the silence was deafening. That's when I heard it. the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the snow. They were getting closer, stopping about 6 feet from my tent. My grip on the gun tightened, my thumb hovering over the safety. Suddenly, there was a brief flash of light outside the tent. It looked like someone had either shined a flashlight or taken a photo. I stayed frozen, heart racing, until I heard the footsteps retreating into the distance. Then, my phone vibrated again. It was a text from the same number. Attached was a photo of my tent, followed by a message. "Have a good night's sleep." Something in me snapped. Adrenaline surged through my body, overpowering the remnants of the weed. I unzipped the tent and fired 2 rounds into the air. Almost immediately, I heard the sound of footsteps running away in the snow. Whoever it was had been watching me the entire time. I screamed a threat into the night, then climbed back into my tent, still clutching my gun. The scare had jolted me awake, and I stayed up for hours, unable to relax. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep. When I woke up to the sunlight, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The nightmare was over. Whoever was stalking me must not have expected me to have a gun. I don't look like the type to own one, and that was the first, and only, time I've ever fired it. Almost 5 years have passed since that night, and I haven't been bothered since. But the memory of that experience still haunts me. It could have ended very differently if I hadn't been armed. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more terrifying tales. Now, here's a question for you. What would you do if you received a mysterious message telling you that someone was watching you in the dark? And which story did you like the most? Share your thoughts in the comments.